I would like first to introduce the chair for this session, Mr. T.V. Madhusudan. He is the Deputy Controller of Patents and Designs in Chennai Patent Office. He is a very familiar, teacher for people in ulcer proximate education. But for others, I would like to tell that he is with the Patent Office since 1997. He joined the ranks as the Examiner of Patents and Designs and then promoted to Assistant Controller and then further promoted to Deputy Controller. He did his MSc in Industrial Chemistry, specialized in pharmaceutical drugs and pesticides, and graduated from REC, which was known at that time, now presently known as NIT, from Warangal in Telangana. In the Patent Office, he is responsible for prosecuting patent applications, mainly in the field of chemistry and pharmaceuticals. The Chennai Patent Office also has the jurisdiction of entire South India and Andaman Nicobar Islands. He is also responsible for disposal of pre-grant, post-grant. He had visited in his official capacity to, countries abroad like Italy, Switzerland, Bangladesh, and also was a delegate during the 16th session of the Standard Committee on Law of Patent at Geneva and contributed toward the process of standardization of international patent law. And as I mentioned earlier, he has been our visiting faculty for ulcer proximate education, especially on patents law course, almost now a decade. And he is also a trained examiner for the Rajiv Gandhi National Institute of IP Management at Nagpur. And he is a speaker in circuits of conference and other things. And as a Deputy Controller, even though his background is from pharmaceuticals, as a Deputy Controller he is in charge of also the issues relating to computer-related inventions which comes to him from the examiners down or also on certain opposition areas. So when I requested him, he readily agreed. And so Mr. T.V. Madhusudan is with us. And he in turn will give a few words about the two speakers who are with him. Professor Matilal from Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law, a product of National Law School of Bangalore, and then also Case Western University in US, who are a good practice area. I think, Swapna Sundar also familiar to you. I thought best to leave the chair and say, not necessarily the whole they are really to us, you can highlight about that and then conduct this. As usual, as I said, we are almost on time to o'clock, and then we have 3:30.
Welcome back. Now we will be having two more interesting topics, and the two speakers who are sitting on my right and left are very well versed with the subject, and it will be interesting for all of you to grasp whatever they say. Now, first speaker will be Mrs. Swapna Sundar, and she is the Managing Director and CEO of IP Dome Strategy Advisors Private Limited, a company she founded in 2008 with Mr. Raghavendra Ravi. As a principal strategist of IP Dome, Swapna enables companies and individual inventors to draft and implement strategies to protect and monetize their intellectual property. She is a lawyer by training with a degree in law from the Madras Law College and an LLM in international law with international relations from the Brussels School of International Studies, the European School of the University of Kent at Canterbury. Currently she is visiting faculty in IP at the Nalsar University of Law and provides IP training at various educational institutions, including the Symbiosis Law School and VAT. She is also invited as a resource person at IP events conducted by the CII. Swapna is a member of Ethics Committee of several institutions, including the National Institute of Epidemiology, National Institute of Siddha, IIT Madras and SRM. She is also a member of the IP Association of South India and was its joint secretary for 2 terms. She is also a member of the IP Advisory Committee of the Tamil Nadu Technology Development and Promotion Center, a joint initiative of the Government of Tamil Nadu and CII. In 2003, she completed a project on rationalization of trade licenses or the Commission of Municipal Administration, Government of Tamil Nadu, and her articles on IP and governance have been published in various newspapers, including the Hindu, Business Line, and the Indian Express. She is the author of the IP Smart Workbook, the Lab to Market Guide to Investing, published by LexisNexis. In April 2016, she published a toolkit and resources as part of a UK IPO project titled the IP Smart Approach to Doing Business in India, to guide UK companies to set up business in India and safeguard their IP. She lives in Chennai with her husband, PVS Giridhar, and their 3 children. Her interests include reading, writing, fitness, dance, and painting. This is about the introduction. I request Swapna Sundar to take over the chair.
Thank you.
No.
So I thank the chair for this opportunity and also Professor Vivek. My subject is quite wide. I am supposed to talk about standard setting organizations and their IP policies. So there are hundreds of organizations that set standards for the hundreds of millions of things that we use every single day. So I was not able to decide which area to look at. So I'm going to look at an area that I'm interested in and studying from a governance aspect, and that is smart cities. So the Smart City Council of India expects that India should have about 100 smart cities. What is the definition of smart? We don't know. How smart it will be? We don't know. Will such smart cities be livable? A big question. And yet, our government is proceeding on these matters. And one of the aspects that we are able to identify, those of us who are studying smart cities seriously, is that there are several bodies setting standards for what is or what are the elements of what smart is. So some of the areas, some of the smart city standard setting bodies are listed here. There is the International Electrotechnical Commission, which talks about power generation, transmission and distribution, solar energy, nanotech, marine energy, and so on. This is not an exhaustive list. So there is ISO, which is an international organization for standards, and they have 20,000 standards, like my husband described it, standards on kingdoms to condoms. ITU is the International Telecommunication Union, which talks about the shared global use of radio spectrum, assigns satellite orbits, improves telecom infrastructure, broadband, internet, wireless technologies, aeronautical and maritime navigation. Think of it, wherever you're going to intersect telecom and any other aspect of our life, ITU is a part of it. India has been a member of ITU from 1869, and we haven't actually contributed, I'm open to correction, we haven't actually contributed to any standards in ITU. CENELEC, which is the European Committee for Electrotechnical Standards. ETSI, there's the European Telecommunication Standards Institute, which has published about 2,000 to 2,500 standards per annum, including the GSM cell phone system, 3G, 4G, any other Gs that are coming along, LPD, smart card. Significant bodies include the smart M2M machines, which is currently controlling our Paytm and things like that, intelligent transport systems, network functions virtualization. Network functions virtualization is something that they have quickly come up in the last couple of years. Cyber security, electronic signatures and infrastructures. CEN, which is again the European Committee for Standardization. CEN and CENELEC are based out of Brussels. And the IEEE SA, Institute of Electrical Electronics Engineers Standards Association, which is a USA-based body. And they talk about electrical power and energy, biomedical technology, healthcare, IT, information assurance, telecom, consumer electronics, and so on. So one wonders, with so much overlap, how are they able to work together? That's actually what standards do. They allow companies with technology competence. They allow countries with technology competence to work together. Let us look at one of them. So the ETSI has a special industry-specific group which talks about context information management. What is context information management? Today, most of the countries or most of the companies or organizations that are managing or monitoring us online are really not concerned about what we are saying. They are more concerned about how often we talk, how long we talk, and to whom we talk. So you get up in the morning, switch on your WhatsApp, you say good morning to 40 of your friends. The 40 of your friends communicate something else to 30 of their friends. That network is monitored. What you say to these 100-odd friends in the first hour of your waking up is immaterial. That is why your message that you get on WhatsApp that says all your messages will be encrypted from today is complete bosh. Because they're not encrypting your data, what you are putting on it. Your content, you own the copyright to your good mornings and your forwards. What they own is the fact that you connected. And that's what they manage, context information. How do you connect, to whom you connect, on what basis you connect, how often you connect, what is the reason for connecting, and what can they derive from that. And so they are developing specifications for a context information management API, data publication platforms, and standard data models to work closely with the ETSI smart M2M devices. So ultimately, what we know and use in our daily lives and what we are likely to continue to be using at least for the next 100 years are all covered by standards. Many of them we have no idea about. How many of us know the difference between CDMA and GSM? Particularly lawyers. Yeah, you do? Yeah? What is the difference? So what I'm saying is that in many of the standard bodies, the organizations, the technical experts who are making the recommendations are also legal experts. But somewhere along the way they learn and they connect to the technical strategies. Many of them may be PhDs in both law and the specific telecommunication or internet protocol that they are working with. What the context information management system will be when it is in patents. So what we did in my office in preparation for this is that we studied the last 50 years of smart city development, and believe me, it's been happening since 1957. So what we thought of as primary interfaces, so one of them is this. This is a system comprising a luminaire lens. So the ITU and some other bodies, IEC and so on, decided that a light fixture should be called a luminaire, just to make it standardized so that everybody knows what it is. A luminaire lens including a surface having a coded positional data pattern, a mobile communication device including a camera, a display screen, a database having database data records representing a floor plan of a building or a structure. So we might be wondering why our country is being overlaid or underlaid with optical fiber cables. So optical fiber communication is when you use light packets to carry information. So your information is communicated in the form of light. I really don't know how that happens, but that's what it is. So somewhere along the way they discovered that if it is light that is going to carry the message, why do we need a camera? Why do we need a sensor? Why can't the light fixture do that for us? So a building like this or a hall like this, we can count about 1, 2, 3 into 4, about 12 to 15 light fixtures. Now if each of these are communicating, then we don't need cameras. We don't need other ways of communicating. And that is exactly what this particular patent talks about. It talks about how you can achieve the floor plan using the light fixtures. So there are international standards for optical fiber communication. So this is a bit like those dolls which you see, you know, where there's a small doll and there's a bigger doll and there's a bigger doll, and you keep taking out like an onion and you keep finding more and more standards. So you come a little out of it and look back into the structure and you find a whole new set of standards. Now what is optical fiber? Who are the people involved? Some of them are common, Some of them are new people. Like in India, there is a Korean body called the Electronic and Technical Research Institute, which is actually a converging body. They are the people who first released for commercial use the GSM platform. So they are the people who are bringing LEDs, some 25 lakh LEDs to Visakhapatnam. So if you look at this, the IEC standards dedicated to fiber optics, you find other specific standards to that. There is SE 860A, which is for fiber, B, which is for fiber optic interconnecting devices and passive components, and 86C, which is for fiber optic systems and active devices. And it keeps going on. So what is Internet of Things? We hear about Internet of Things all the time. So there is a definition for Internet of Things, which was given by the ITU as a global infrastructure for information society, enabling advanced services by interconnecting physical and virtual things based on existing and evolving interoperable information and communication technologies. So whatever we are using today, a couple of mics, a system, my phone, the light, the fan, all of it is going to be talking to each other and to be communicating this data. Now there are manufacturers involved, there are designers involved, there are people involved who are fixing these fixtures. All of these people have to know what connects to what. So today, if you have a projector that doesn't talk to your Apple laptop, then you're not going to get through the day. So there has to be somebody who says, okay, Apple does not talk to this projector, we need a different projector, or we need an adapter cable, or whatever it is. So that's where all these aspects of standards come in. The interesting part is standards evolve from technology evolution. You can't make a standard first and then build a technology to it. Of course, that also happens, but it largely follows the technology trajectory. So you evolve digital platforms, then your standards follow into digital platforms. You evolve space travel, then your standards follow into space travel, right? So Dr. Anindya here will be talking a bit more on the legal aspects and FRAND licensing and so on. So I'm not going to go that much into it. I'm sure that I can't match his level of knowledge there. So I'll stick to what I am better at. So if you look at this, once the systems evolved to become smart, now the next level is a digital city, right? So what is the necessity of the standards for a digital city? What are the requirements, standard requirements for a digital city are already available in your patent documents. Patent documents are a minimum of 5 years in the priority, before the technology actually reaches the market. So if you really want to know what your life is going to look like in the smart city, you need to look at patents that they are filing today. And you will know what is going to be happening in 5 years. So here if you see, this is an e-city support system. And this is talking about how you get various kinds of feeds from various video devices, video cameras that are put along the city. So if you see here, a method comprising acquiring surveillance data of a predetermined geographical area using a monitoring arrangement, analyzing the surveillance data to detect at least one of a predetermined activity. So this is a post-mapping device. You know that in Nalsar every 3 days there is going to be some function. Yeah? So you know what is the predetermined activity you are looking out for. So these are surveillance for already mapped events. If they don't happen, there is a problem. If it's happening, they know how to control that. This is very useful, of course, in defense, but also in stadia, like football stadia, where people are likely to go into a riot at any moment. So you know what is the predetermined activity that is going to trigger this. And you're already aware of how the predetermined activity was going to look in data points. So this is an information system for public transportation and corresponding communication methods. Now here if you see, it is a plurality of contactless transceivers that allow a data transfer. The data bus is connected with transceivers and data processing so that any passenger is able to receive information about the bus or any other activity or any alert on his phone. So it's not necessary that the bus should be fitted with any audio speakers or any hailers or any of those things. Your device operates as soon as you come into the bus as a public device, public receiver. If you go to the last part, passengers' identification data being stored in their terminals in such a manner that the system can also be used for checking the passengers' travel authorizations. This is where our Aadhaar comes in. Aadhaar is not only there for providing rations to hungry people. You know, Aadhaar has a lot more data in it than you need for a PWD purpose. What you actually need it for is travel authorizations and identifications. So there is a whole system operating in the background, compatibly accumulating data over large populations in order to enable this. This looks very, very benign even, very positive. Oh, I don't have to stand in a line to buy a bus ticket. But the same technology will be used for immigration control, border processing, riot control, entering or leaving a government office, going into a court or a public place, police stations. So ultimately, standards operate in a variety of ways, and all the people who are operating in the standardized, harmonized ecosystem are actually doing things that are interoperable. So if you go to the airport today, you will find Safran machines. Have you gone to the airport recently? At least I saw in the Bangalore airport 2 Safran machines. Safran and Morpho are the company that collects and maintains our Aadhaar data in the US. They don't maintain it in India. And both Safran and Morpho are defense and border control products. One of the aspects that I just want to talk about is called iris at a distance. So the Morpho iris at a distance device that takes our iris scan for the purpose of Aadhaar actually allows the airport to monitor us at a distance. And what is the distance? It's 200 meters. So from 200 meters, if the Safran scanner and the Safran machine are talking to each other, the reader are talking to each other, then we are in surveillance from 200 meters off. This actually tells us how standardized the systems are and how deep these systems run. So there is horizontal standardization, there is vertical standardization to quite a great depth, because now earlier the Morpho Trust was saying we are not going to do Aadhaar for children below 5. Now they are saying below 3. And in a couple of years they expect to go to children up to 3 months old. So this is how the systems are being standardized. Professor Madhu, I think. So who are these? No sir, now it's okay. So who are these standard setting organizations? They can be governmental organizations whose primary activities are developing, coordinating, promulgating, revising, amending, issuing, reissuing, interpreting, or otherwise producing technical standards intended to address the needs of a group of affected adopters. So we'll come back to this affected adopters in a bit. So they can be governmental organizations, they can be quasi-governmental organizations, they can be a private company like Qualcomm. Qualcomm is the owner of the CDMA standards. GSM standards are owned by, or standards are written by an industry consortium from Europe. And that is the reason why GSM is slightly more popular than CDMA. Yeah, there are technical differences, but definitely this is one of the reasons. Standards are the technical specifications for a new product or a process. Standards ensure interoperability. So even though you may have a different kind of, like an Apple laptop, if you want to make it talk to your Microsoft device, you need standards. And both these parties need to be able to come onto a common platform and talk. And what do? Laptop, display, keyboard, mouse, camera, Bluetooth, USB port, motherboard, battery, operating system. It sounds like a supermarket of technologies. Is hardly anything that is non-standardized. So who are these affected adopters? They are the technology owners, the manufacturers. Are users adopters? Are users affected adopters? We don't have a choice, to be honest. We don't have a choice. Our country decides GSM standards, we all use GSM phones. We really don't have a choice. That's one of the criticisms against industry-wide standards. And definitely, once the country has decided, once the government has decided, there is less choice that users have. How are standards set? So the basic ways in how standards are set. First, they pick a technology that they want to work on, and then they look at all the alternatives that are available to that technology. If there is a free, non-proprietary technology available, then they would prefer to use that. But if there is a proprietary technology and there is no alternative technology to that, then they will try to convince the owner of the patent or owner of the technology to release those standards on a free, reasonable and non-discriminatory fashion, again to the stakeholders, not to us, not to people, not to the users of that technology or adapters in the market of that technology, but manufacturers and those who want to build on those standards. So those are the investing bodies in that market. So there are also competing standard setting organizations like CDMA and GSM. So there are some who pick one or the other for various reasons. The National Telecom Policy of 2012, they formed two private-public SSOs. One is called the Global ICT Standard Forum of India, and the other is called the Developmental Organization of Standard for Telecom in India. I was not able to find any standards that they have set, but there are a list of standards to which we have subscribed, or standards which we have accepted will operate in India interoperably. So every standard that is used in India in this sector has to be approved by the Ministry of Telecom and IT. So different standards, different authorities are there which will say for water one standard, for clothes one standard, and so on. So coming to the second part of my topic, what are the IP policies these standard setting bodies check? How do they come upon an IP policy? So I've looked at some of their policies, not all of them, again not exhaustive, and taken some of the core ideas that are there. The first objective for the ITU, ISO, IEC compatibility objective is compatibility. How do IEC, ISO and ITU work together? What are the different standards they need to make compatible or interoperable? Their recommendations talk about accessibility. Accessibility by manufacturers, accessibility by further developers, accessibility by inventors and R&D organizations. Detailed patent arrangements are left to the parties who own their technologies. They don't make it a necessary condition that once you have come into the standard, you have to share it with others. That is left to each party. A full disclosure is desirable, which means that once a company says, I have a standard, I have a proposal to standardize something, they must say these are the patents that I have in this area, and this is the complete patent or the list of patents that I own. So full disclosure is desirable. Sometimes they disclose, sometimes they don't disclose. When the patent holder is not willing to comply with the licensing recommendations, they don't normally use that patent, or they try not to use that patent in that standard. So that is the ITU's policy. It's not that every body works with the same IP policy. This is what the ITU policy says, that if you are not willing to license it to us or license it to other members, then we're not going to use you. There is a written statement condition, which means that every time you say this is the patent that is coming under the standard, then you have to make a written statement of declaration saying I am releasing these standards, and also say what are the licensing conditions for that standard. ETSI has a slightly different policy. The objective here is to reduce risk and reward people for the use of standards. So they are more concerned about if you don't have standardized processes, then you're going to come into interoperable situations, and that may lead to loss in business, loss of investment and so on. So we want to reduce risk. And the second is to reward they reward the members to enable or invite them to use the standards a little more. At the same time, they want to strike a balance between standardization and the rights of the owners of IPR. Now, do these things really matter in practice? Sometimes they do, because ETSI has wider collaborations. ITU is a UN body, so they talk more to the governments. ETSI talks to companies, it talks to universities, talks to different types of people, where the requirement for a balance between rights of IPR and standardization may be more important. So the member proposing the standard should draw attention to the IPR of other members. So I am proposing a standard. I know that in order to implement this standard, I will need these patents also to be on board. Then it is the duty of the proposing member to identify those standards. But there is no force to do an IPR search. You don't have to do an all-out search and identify every small patent in that area. Disclosure of one patent in the family is sufficient. So sometimes we file the same patent in different jurisdictions to get protection in different countries. So it's not necessary that you have to list every patent filed in every country. One patent filed in any one country is quite sufficient. The SEP owner has to undertake to do a reasonable and non-discriminatory license within 3 months. So here it's not a matter of willingness to comply. Once the standard has been accepted, then it is required that the owner of the patent undertake to do that. And where license is not possible, work on the standard will cease. So if I propose a standard, others are not willing to work with me, then there's no point in going forward on that. So we must understand that the standard setting bodies are not, oh, what happened? They are not, entirely not for profit. I won't say that they're making huge profits on that, but definitely they are not doing They're not doing it for free. So they do have their own IP also in mind. So we are here talking about the IP in the technology owned by the members. They do try to maintain some best practices. They also take care to protect their own IP. So most of these organizations have a copyright policy. The copyright policy determines the price at which these standards will be available to adopters. They are not available for free. And sometimes they are extremely, extremely expensive. So a couple of standards that we have worked with, it's like 80,000 rupees for 10 pages of standards. And the deeper you go into it, the more expensive it becomes. And eventually you do realize that working within the standards is not really inexpensive. Primarily because, one, you have to go by the document to be standardized, within quotes, be certified as interoperable with others. It's not enough for me to do a self-declaration that I'm interoperable with Apple. Apple needs to say they are interoperable, or the CDMA or ITU has to say that they are interoperable. So when you need to get a certification, there is a cost to it, like ISO, any ISO standard that we try to comply with. So research project bodies whom they might work with are also bound by the copyright. Original copyright holder may be free to exploit to the extent that it does not spoil the business or market of the SSO. Reproduction rights by permission. Sometimes they permit it for industry bodies to make publications in specific journals or specific conferences, probably as a means of promoting that standard in the relevant organization or community or industry sector. Publications are not free of charge. Okay, so, just make it the last slide, or second last slide. The second last slide, yeah. So, what I'm actually seeing, yeah, that one please, the green one. Please come down to the 19th slide. Yeah. So, what I'm actually talking about in terms of governance issues in smart cities and so on is that there is a standards thicket. and there is a ticket or a pool of organizations or a pool of companies which are working within these standards, it's very difficult. They put entry barriers to new companies to come in. If there is an IBM-led consortium for smart cities, it's very difficult to enter that. And it's also quite important for us to participate in these standard setting bodies at a deeper level, particularly if we are spending millions of crores, and those, all of that money is going to be invested back in India. So I'll finish with this one example. In Chennai, we have right now work going on under our streets, which is the Chennai Metro Rail Limited, is building tunnels under us. And these tunnels are being built by China and Russia. So the Shanghai Urban Construction Group is the Shanghai Municipality, and the Moscow Metro Railway and the Moscow Trans-Tunneling Corporation are the companies that are building it. There is no patent filed by these companies in India. They have absolutely no idea what they are putting in. The R&D is so secure and so secret that it's not even open to a citizen's audit. So while, our government is talking about border issues and fear of Chinese invasions and Pakistanis attacking us on the borders, we actually have a Chinese organization operating under our city, and there's absolutely no idea what they are doing there. So this kind of work is happening around the country, and it's difficult to determine what these standards are. If we don't know what these standards are, we will be dependent on them for maintenance, upgrades, evolution, development, extension, and whatever else is required to keep a municipality moving. So we need to be aware of this aspect of standards tickets, and we have in our country a number of Technopolis godfathers, one of them from Andhra and Telangana. So there you have his name, Nara Chandrababu Naidu, who is given awards by various organizations like ETSI and ETRI. So technopolises or smart cities or industrial townships are all dependent on such people. Probably it is also important or responsible, it's a responsibility of ours to ask these people what they are approving. So I leave you with this. Thank you very much.
Please reserve your questions after the next speaker comes to work. And next speaker is Mr. Matilal. He is assistant professor from IIT Kharagpur. Mr. Matilal did his first LLM from National Law School, Bangalore. He also did LLM in intellectual property law from Case Western University, USA. He was in top 1% of his batch. He was awarded Fulbright scholarship to pursue research at Spangenberg Center for Law Technology and the Arts, USA. He got CALI Excellence for the Future awarded by Center for Computer Assisted Legal Instruction, Chicago, USA, for his research work on pharmaceutical data exclusivity, which is a very, very great work actually. He received Microsoft Outstanding Main Faculty Award in 2009, awarded by Microsoft Corporation USA to conduct research on the application of DOE in software patents. He practiced at the bar of the High Court of Calcutta and Supreme Court of India and worked as a partner in Khaitan and Partners. Currently, he is the faculty at IIT Kharagpur Law School, where he teaches copyright law and music law. His publication includes a book on software intellectual property law and the European intellectual property review articles on data exclusivity. His areas of research interest are secondary copyright infringement, digital copyright, court system, reform for effective IP enforcement, and music licensing. Now the floor is for you, sir.
Good afternoon. Hyderabad is famous for two things. One, my son told me, biryani. The other one is Charminar. Now, suppose Sanjeev Kapoor writes a book that how to make biryani. That particular book will have copyright. However, all of us would be able to have biryani by following the process mentioned in the book. Computer programs are like biryani making books. The text of the program, the source code and the object code are the lines of the book, and the functionality is the process of making biryani. Now, obviously, if Sanjeev Kapoor, he wants that the novel method of preparing biryani should be protected, he should run to patent office first and obtain a process patent, and then only he should feel like writing the books. Before I get into my slides and get into the issue of these intellectual property protection for interoperable elements of software, certain cardinal guidelines that guide us we need to understand, and I know all of you know, but I'll be just helping you to recollect what we know. First thing, what Newton has told us, that we are standing on the shoulders of the giants. What we do today is based on the pre-existing notions and pre-existing works. Every innovation today is based on pre-existing innovation. We start from where our predecessors have left. Secondly, intellectual property is also intellectual property in the sense of investment protection law. Intellectual property norms are norms that maintain a delicate incentive balance between the individual owner's right over copyright or patent and the public interest to stand on the shoulders of the giant. These are the norms that regulate the norms of intellectual property and also the competition law. Now, how many of you are from technical background here? How many of you are from computer science? Okay. So now let me start with, as a lawyer, I'll start with the layman's understanding of interoperability, and then I'll come to the technical definition of interoperability. By interoperability, what I mean as a lawyer, it's simply there is a plug and the wall socket. Now you understand the distance between the pins of that plug. That fits into the wall socket. So wall socket determines what would be the distance between the plugs. In addition to that, let us pursue this analogy further. Let us understand, we need to also understand that what kind of current is flowing in the wall socket. Is it AC or is it DC? Is it actually 55 hertz or more than that? And let's say that even if the plug fits into the wall socket, but the current impulse is different, there will be a disastrous consequence waiting for your device. Now there are definitions coming from different organizations, the organizations like say the IEEE. Then we have definitions which are coming from the Network-Centric Operation Industry Consortium. They have come out with an interoperable definition. To be very precise, we live in an interoperable world. And if we look into the economics of interoperability, so there is, when you are using your mobile phone, a kind of interoperability is there between the operating system, the Android platform, and the hardware. Then the apps which you use and the Android and the operating system which we are using, that interoperability is maintained, and everywhere there are interoperability working, and this is how the interoperability works. Now my previous speaker, she has spoken about the standard setting organizations and Dr. Sarkar will be speaking on FRAN royalties. The purpose of my presentation today is to find out what is the scope of intellectual property protection of interoperable elements. Are they protected under copyright law? Are they well protected even under patent? Or do we need a separate sui generis system for the purpose of protecting the proprietary rights of the developers and as well as for protecting the public rights of the individual to stand on the shoulders of the giants? Now, come back to where we are. Suppose the question is, the wall socket makers determine the interoperability. Suppose a person comes out with a brilliant plug, but the distance between the plugs, what you see, are different, he will be having no tickets. So, the property right over interoperability can lead to two consequences. The first consequence is monopoly, and the second consequence is market failure. What we have seen in earlier days, the hardware manufacturer will also come out with a software so that he or she can lock in the user and lock out the competitors. Lock in the users and lock out the competitors, and therefore the scope of property right protection over interfaces determines the most pertinent question that what would be the behavior of the market and what would be the behavior of the system. Now here, as we have seen that the software source code, the object code, the preparatory design material, even the flow chart is protected under copyright law. Whereas the functionality part would get patent protection provided it satisfies the per se definition appearing in our Patent Act. Now this is the simple definition of computer program which you all know. I do not want to get into this. The question is that we protect source code, we protect object code, we protect the preparatory design material. Now, who gains control? This is what I was pointing out. You can lock out the computer, lock in the user by locking out your competitors, and this is what the norms will determine. Now, the question which we'll be asking, what is the scope and extent of copyright protection for interface specification? Secondly, what is the scope of reverse engineering? Is it allowed in India? Is it allowed in USA? Or what are the norms? Now, if you look into the paradigms, in USA they have dealt with this issue through their case law system. In EU, there is a legislative approach, and through the software database directive, and database directive, they have actually addressed this issue. Now, this is actually the early mistake. Again, this mistake has been revived by one of the decisions of the Federal Circuit Court of Appeal, which is called Oracle versus Google. What it says, that the commercial and competitive objective which does not enter into somewhat metaphysical issue of whether particular ideas or expression have merged. So, before I get into all these terminologies, let me explain few doctrines of copyright law. Very simple. First thing, that copyright law does not protect ideas, copyright law does not protect methods, copyright law does not protect procedures, copyright law does not protect the process mentioned in that particular text. Now, I give you a book. If I give you a book and say that, okay, now kindly kindly filter out those elements which copyright law does not protect. Give me a pure gloss of copyrightable nectar which is pure copyrightable expression. In any copyright infringement suit, you have to, the plaintiff needs to establish that the defendant had taken those nectars, not the uncopyrightable elements. If the copyright, because there may be striking similarity between the defendant's work and the plaintiff's work, those similarities may result from the things which are in public domain, which are dictated by the idea expression merger doctrine. Now, this idea expression merger doctrine is little complex than what I am saying. Even if it is an idea, sometime even if it is an expression, sometimes copyright law does not give protection. Suppose, showing respect to your elderly people is actually an idea. And that idea can be represented in various ways, like namaste, or say if you are, let's say that a former Nazi party member, you will be saying, hey Hitler. Or if you are a communist, you will be saying red salute. These are all expressions of a particular idea called showing respect to elderly people or your boss. However, all these expressions are something which we call sins affair. Sins affair means a method of expression which has become standard for expressing an idea. Today, let's say that you are making a movie on Hitler, and if the first person who made a hit movie on Hitler, he showed that Himmler is addressing Hitler as hey Hitler, and you say that this is my expression, you cannot use it, do you expect that the second comer to make a movie on Hitler saying that you should, in your movie, Himmler should address Hitler as Namaste Hitlerji? That would be a great fun movie, not a serious movie. Similarly, in the context of computer program, the question is this: which are the elements which have become standard mode of expressing an idea? Those expression, although their expression cannot be protected by copyright law. And this is what the court has said. That court said there is only one idea per program, and that particular idea is therefore the only idea. Everything else in a computer is a copyright protected material. This analogy was further pursued in the case of Whelan versus Jaslow Dental Laboratories case. In this case, what happens, a person writes a computer code in event-driven language. Then after that, the person who made it, he finds that it is not compatible with many of the platforms, hardware platforms. So he rewrites the same program in a different language. In basics, he writes the same program. The issue comes up before the court that whether it's a copyright infringement or not. The court says, yes, it is a copyright infringement. Again, court has applied a test which is called SSO, not Standard Setting Organization. The meaning of this abbreviation is Structured Sequence Organization. Structured sequence organization of a program is protected by copyright law, and therefore the interoperable elements, they are also codes, therefore they are also protected. The court in this particular case gave a very broader protection to copyrightable, to interfaces, including the interfaces. Now here I have one more copyright principles to state. The copyright principle is known as the non-literal copyright protection. Suppose Mr. X has written a novel. I do not take a single line, single expression therein. The actual lines, the actual English style, I do not take, but I rewrite the same story with the same structure, with same sequence of event with same interplay of characters and same plot without taking a single line text, I'll be infringing his copyright, and this theory is known as the theory of non-literal copyright. The theory of non-literal copyright is famous statement coming from Professor Niemeyer. He says the copyright in a work can be infringed in two ways, either by a comprehensive literal similarity, means textual similarity, or either by a fragmented literal similarity, you take few lines only, you infringe, or by a comprehensive non-literal similarity, taking the whole structure. So if I take the whole structure of somebody else's program, I rewrite the program in a different language, perhaps I will be infringing copyright. The quote went wrong, the quote goes wrong, and these are the points, and I am not getting into this because there is a time limit for this. Now what happens? Again, a case comes. Because now quote in Hoelem, as I have said that there is only one idea for a program, and let's say that the idea of a program, let's say that if we go by Hoelem's decision today, the idea of your word processing program is to make your computer behave like a typewriter and accept that behavioral aspect. Everything else is copyrightable as per the Hoelem decision. Then comes actually a seminal case called Computer Resources versus Altai. And in this case again, what happens, in order to achieve compatibility, the competitor incorporates in his computer program a device that makes the computer compatible with other system. The court now says, is faced with the challenge that what is the scope of non-literal copyright for computer program. The court comes out with a kind of analysis which is called the abstraction filtration comparison test. And this test is again under challenge because of, I'll come to that. The abstraction filtration comparison test is a test. Now, suppose I have, after all these statements which I have made, if you tell me, Mr. Motilal, do one thing, I am giving you a book, kindly filter out, take out those uncopyrightable elements which you are talking about, like sins of array, the merger, then public domain element, and all this stuff, you take it out. Can I create a theoretical filter so that if I pour the book on that particular filter, what comes out is the copyrightable expression, and what is not copyrightable, that remains on the top of the net. Here, the court creates a theoretical filtering system. The court actually, see, this is actually a theoretical reverse engineering of the software. And theoretical reverse engineering is reconstituting the source code from the object code. Again, take it from me, and we all know that computer does not understand what is object code also, even machine readable language. Computer only understand only the logic flow of presence and absence of electrical impulses. To be very precise, computer program is nothing but a bewildering string of presence and absence of electrical impulses. If that is so, can I filter it out? They have applied that. They said, okay, this interoperability is something which is dictated by the industry standard. What happened? The Tsar in Russia, he laid down railway track throughout Russia. Then he thought that my railway track, the distance between the two tracks should not be same as that of Europe. His purpose was to, he was actually a clever guy. He thought that if there is an innovation coming from Europe, at least they cannot move their engine in my line. And that is what the compatibility today. Do you want to allow somebody else's train to run in your truck? The code says that this compatibility is something which is dictated by the industry standard, and it is very similar to what we call Hare-Hitler formula. This particular formula has been approved, and I'll just go through a kind of brief chart that this is what the cases are, and there are a number of cases. This chart shows that the logic, the conclusion is same, however different logics are being applied by different courts in different scenarios. Now, the second part I am now coming up, I'll be looking at. The word reverse engineering in the context of computer software, we have two different meanings. One we call the black box reverse engineering, the other one is called decompilation or disassembly, depending upon where you are, in which jurisdiction you are. Now, to be very precise, disassembly is reconstituting the source code from the machine readable object code, and black box reverse engineering, you do not touch the computer, but you understand, study, and observe the working of the computer system. This is called black box reverse engineering. This black box reverse engineering, again, the question that comes up, that the code says yes, in order to understand the interoperable part, you can reverse engineer a software, and obviously you can go beyond the scope of black box reverse engineering. You can disassemble or decompile a software. The question that now the response comes from the European directive, and directive has also answered this question in a similar line. But this is the understanding. Now, the Indian standard, although the legislature has not named it, but I think this would be the proper name. We do have provisions in our Copyright Act that deals with decompilation and black box reverse engineering. The first one is actually a disassembly. Second one is a black box reverse engineering provision. Now, in this context, I'll come to a kind of debate which is called the interchangeability and the debate between the competing program and the connecting program. Suppose, see, this is the original program. This is, let's say that for the time being that this is an Android platform, and this is, say, a all call recorder program, and this is also a call recorder program. As you can see that these interfaces, these interfaces are similar, and therefore they can get into any platform which supports these interfaces. The question is this, that can I reverse engineer my competitor's interface to understand, to make it compatible with a particular platform, or should I have to understand the compatibility requirement from the wall socket itself? The question is this, can I reverse engineer my competitor's plug to understand the interoperability, or I have to reverse engineer the wall socket itself to understand the compatibility? This question has not been answered even in the United States. In the case of Lotus versus Borland, what happened, I have not referred to that. The court in fact said that if you are decompiling your competitor's plug, it is a copyright infringement. But if you are understanding the interface requirement by reverse engineering the wall socket, it is not a copyright infringement. Now, the settled position, so now reverse engineering is allowed. This is coming from American Supreme Court and says that reverse engineering is allowed. There are new threats, 3 new threats to interoperability, which has come up. The first rate is actually a provision which is known as the TPM measure, the Technological Protection Measure. Suppose I encrypt a copyrighted text with a lock, and that locks prevents the text to be copied by others. If I break that lock, the technological protection measure, if I circumvent, will it amount to copyright infringement? The law says yes. Now I use that particular TPM measure, technological protection measure, to protect my interfaces. In that case, in order to understand the interfaces, which is a fair use within the meaning of Indian Copyright Act, will it, see, the taking up interface is obviously a fair use, but breaking the lock and then taking the interface would be a criminal offense under section 65A of the Copyright Act. So TPM measure has created new interoperability problem. The second part is basically with regard to the shrink wrap licenses. When the software vendors, they discovered that they cannot protect their interfaces through copyright, they thought that we should incorporate contractual obligation on the purchaser, on the licensee, so that the license condition binds him, so that the reverse engineering of the interoperable part is not done by someone who is a licensee. The third, the ghost of Whelan, which was forgotten for almost 25 years, has recently been revived by the Federal Circuit Court of Appeal in the case of Google versus Oracle. Now, what would be the Indian response? The Indian scenario of shrink wrap licensing would be, section 23 of the Contract Act says, a contract which is against a contract, to be very precise, cannot override the written provisions of law. Now section 52 A, B and AC, they allow black box reverse engineering and as well as decompilation. Can a shrink wrap contract in India or a click wrap contract in India override the provisions of 52(1) A, B and AC? The further question is this, that we need to also understand the rules of private international law in this regard. When you click a yes button in India, irrespective of the fact, the question that has to be answered, that what is the lex loci contractors, what is the lex loci solutionist, and what is the lex loci procedure. So these things we need to understand, and to my understanding, perhaps it is hit by section 23 of the Contract Act. Section 65A says that for the purpose not expressly prohibited by this act, you can do it. Suppose TPM measures can be broken by the Computer Science Department of IIT Kharagpur. You can, the Nalsar University can break a TPM measure for the purpose of testing the robustness of the cyber security here in Nalsar University. Those exceptions are given there. However, the question is this, that can TPM measures be circumvented for the purpose of understanding or unlocking the interoperable elements? Yes. Now here comes Oracle. The issue before the court is 37 packages, 37 APIs of belonging to Oracle. And those data structure, those communication protocols were copied in the Android platform. The question that comes up before the court, that whether this is a copyright violation or not, the district court says it is a fair use. However, the matter involved both patent issues and copyright issues. Otherwise, the appeal should have gone to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal in California. Because of the patent issue, the matter surfaces, the appeal goes to Washington DC before the Court of Appeal of Federal Circuit, which you know that there is a national appeal court there which determines all patent appeals. Federal Circuit Court suddenly says, and this is what Federal Circuit Court says, the structure, sequence and organization of a computer program are protectable by copyright law. In the last 2.5 decades, the courts and commentators have recognized that this is what the court says, that overall structure of Oracle's API packages is creative, original, and resembles a taxonomy, and therefore it is protected by copyright law. There are fundamental flaws because SSO test is not a proper test it's not a proper filter to filter out the unprotectable copyrighted elements from the copyright protected elements. Secondly, there is another flaw. The flaw is actually the Federal Circuit Court misunderstood the very understanding, the computer science understanding of data structure. The court, in fact, what happens if as a programmer you think that there is no one to guide you and there is only one mode of expressing a particular idea, if you do that, you may not get copyright protection. Here simply what court is saying, court misunderstands the merger doctrine of copyright law, and court says that yes, if you think, say for example, the graphical user interfaces like forward bottom and the bottom, the arrows I mentioned, home bottom, can it be protected by copyright? Is it an expression? The 100% yes. But home button and home, the idea and expression has merged. So in that case, there cannot be a copyright protection at all. Now, as you know that we can, even in patent law also, it is possible to protect it in two ways you can protect the software patent. One is by means of a function or straight away directly by protecting the interfaces. I will conclude by actually drawing an analogy from what happened when computer science was developed. Today, the computing power which your mobile phone is having, that computing power can also be achieved without having a software. The only thing you need, in order to achieve that computing speed of your mobile phone, you need a mobile phone which should be larger than the NALSA campus. Software has replaced the machine. Again, we can replace those softwares by machine. The question is this, that software is in fact a machine. Can a machine be protected by copyright law? On the other hand, software is just like written lines of text. So far as source code is concerned, the high-level languages is concerned. Can a text be protected by patent law? We are trying to fit in something which does not fit into the compartment of either copyright law or patent law. In fact, in 1978, when the issue comes up, World Intellectual Property Organization says that let us come out with a new system, sui generis system for protecting the proprietary information of software. Under the US pressure they did it, and today the more you try to fit it into the compartment of copyright, the more you try to fit it into the compartment of patent, you will be, because the traditional understanding of copyright and traditional understanding of patent law cannot address the digital need. We need a separate sui generis computer. We can do it for IPIC. We can come out with an integrated circuit layout topography designer having two copyright design so far being registered. Why cannot we have a sui generis copyright law or sui generis law to protect the intellectual property in software? And to be very precise, that I need protection for life plus 60? Today is software, tomorrow it is nothing, it is obsolete. I need a shorter protection but a stronger protection. I need a protection which would be facilitating computation, at the same time also taking care of the investment which is made by the person who made the software. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Position. Now have a sui generis system of protecting software patents. Without briefing on their lectures, may I ask you to pose any questions if at all you have? One or two questions, because we are running short of time.
You're talking about iris scanning and all stuff. Is it not a violation of right of privacy? It's more specifically right to be forgotten or right to be left alone, and in general, at the bigger level, my Article 21 rights. And even if I say I have given a consent, will it not be barred by coercion, standard form of contract, and other exceptions?
It so happens that these systems are being implemented in a coercive way, and I was talking to Professor Madhu in the morning as well. They are also implementing them in a somewhat deceptive manner by saying that it's a welfare legislation. So not all harmonization, not all standardization is always good for the society, and this is primarily happening because, as I was also pointing out, all standard setting organizations do not think of citizens as stakeholders. So today the JICA Smart City, Indians are not stakeholders. The stakeholders are JICA, IBM, the investors in the, JICA is Japan International Cooperation Agency, the investors there. So as long as we are not stakeholders, we have little control over the standardization process. And probably one more thing that I always say is that if we are not paying for it, then we are the product. So when you are collecting your Aadhaar for free, somebody else is paying for it. Yeah.
I want to ask one question related to this one. Maybe Sir also can add here. Because as he pointed out, a lot of data is gathered without our approval. Okay? And okay, some cases you are required for the basis of providing best services to the citizens as well as the controlling the citizens how they are living and protecting the country maybe from terrorism, I appreciate. But what the government of India or any standards organization putting in place some standards to protect or stop the misuse of the data in this regard, so that at least we can be safe. Okay, even without my permission, that they can have the assurance that okay, that is in the safer hands, it is not misused by the people.
Are you going to answer? So no, as far as I know, I was actually at a meeting in Bangalore of the Democratic Governance and Accountability Standards organization, and we are unable to discover any standards. That's what I would say. But it's also important to state that this data is not being held in India.
Yeah,
so they are, however, covered by standards of US security, National Security Agency. So they are holding our data in the same standards to which they are supposed to hold the data of their citizens or their immigrant citizens. That's all the answer I have, really. So you're saying a global standard? There is a global standard, but the global standard is a security standard. Yeah.
Is it not like having a standard for how to make a drug?
Yeah.
Without actually that being legal? Let's say, I mean, if you have drug in the sense, I'm not meaning by medicine, but what I'm saying is a drug. So if you just have a standard, I mean, how can you have a standard like that, first of all? Can you have a standard for something which is illegal? Can you actually have a standard?
Yeah. See, the way I look at it is that India should have standards, and they should make some effort to standardize how it is collected, how it is held. And that is probably one reason why the Supreme Court has held that Aadhaar is not mandatory. So as of now, we are not required under the Supreme Court law, or the judgment of the Supreme Court. We are not required to hold Aadhaar cards. We are not required to submit Aadhaar data. And one issue which you talked about, the right to be forgotten. So one part of it is, yes, if I want to de-enroll, can I do that? As of now, it doesn't exist. But at the same time, the Ministry of IT or the other departments which are involved in it have approved it. It is the standardization and the evolution are happening at a very high level, at very, technically speaking, we should have had a kind of a Brexit type of a referendum. People should have been asked, do you want this or you don't want this?
Okay, quickly we'll move to, let us stop the discussion here.
Excuse me, now I think there is no end for this discussion. So we will move to the next. Any question, last question? Yeah.
We'll exit for tea.
Yes.
I have a question regarding to this standardization, because different standards, if we follow that, whenever we follow these different kind of standards, obviously it leads to more conflicts of law. Maybe that might lead to more litigation purposes. So even the judiciary also may not be in a position in order to have some kind of stance like that. I mean, in my opinion, what do you say regarding to that? Because of different kinds of standards which we follow.
Actually, standards are useful for manufacturers, product developers, for R&D. It's definitely useful because they are in the market, the existing products are already there. Like Professor Matilal was saying, if the socket is there, the plug has to comply. So to that extent, yes, they are useful for manufacturers.
So my question is in context with what you've spoken there. So we do not have either a copyright law or a patent law for programs as such. And you also mentioned that in 1970s something that there was an attempt that can we have something else other than these two? Do we have any progress with that? Is there any third kind of provision?
See, actually, so far I know in 1978, World Intellectual Property Organization, they proposed that software is neither patentable nor copyrightable. So let us come out with a kind of sui generis system. But if you look into the history of US copyright law, there was a commission appointed to basically revise the US copyright law, which is called CON2. And it's called Presidential Commission on Copyright, because they replaced their old Copyright Act of 1909 by 1976 Copyright Act. That committee proposed that copyright should be protected as a copyrightable work, as a literary work, computer program. And that very idea was mooted by US, and US incorporated, and later on the negotiation of WTO was going on. And then the countries started protecting it as a literary work within the meaning of Bonn Convention. And now you see that this has come in TRIPS also. TRIPS says that computer programs are copyrightable and they can be protected as if they are literary works. But do you say one more proposition here? The purpose of copyright is to get protection over the expression. But the idea is revealed from day one. If I ask you the question that the source, the object code, what idea it reveals? Perhaps this is the only copyrightable work where the quid pro quo of revealing the idea is not there. You are getting a protection over the text, the code elements, without revealing this idea, which doesn't happen in case of a novel. If Sanjeev Kapoor writes a book that how to make biryani, novel biryani, he would be obviously disclosing the idea. But a computer vendor does not need to make the idea public, because the computer vendor is giving you the source code, the object code, and that doesn't reveal anything. So even the quid pro quo system of copyright is not addressed in computer software copyright. Whereas patent is concerned, the test is what you call the AT&T case, that is the benchmark, which says that there should be useful, tangible, concrete result. And again this particular formula has been revived after Alice. So after Alice, what has happened, if you look into the post-Alice decisions coming from the US courts, it is you see the fluctuating fortune of justice, the swinging pendulum there. Because one pro-patentability to anti-patentability, anti-patentability to pro-patentability, this is the swing what is happening in case of patent. So if you are not feeling comfortable with either patent or copyright, why not put it under a sui generis system?
So now we'll be closing this session. Now over to the organizer.